So in reading about today's authors, I found a quote from our wonderful first speaker, Jennifer Haigh, who said about writing, but I think it can apply to life in general: the best thing somebody can do for you is to put the right book in your hands at the right time. And that's what we hope to do for you today. So thank you again for coming. So on for our first speaker, I'm going to give you some quotes. And the first is, remarkably successful, emotionally rich, engrossing. And that's the Wall Street Journal's response to Jennifer Haigh's Faith, a novel spun around a Boston clergy abuse scandal whirling in the year 2002. An affecting tale to the power of a charismatic predator and the acquiescence of his victims. That was the Boston Globe on her novel, Mrs. Kimball. And here's another quote: perceptive and gripping, the exploration of a damaged group of people who rediscover the undeniable bonds of blood. And that's the Miami Herald on Jennifer's novel, The Condition. One more quote: holy cow. That was me. When I received word that the author of these books and so much more would be headlining our Bookies event today. I credit Karen Hoban, seated at the first table here, our Vice President for Planning and Student Development here at Bay Path, with not only coming up with the idea for the Are You A Bookies event, but also, this was 5 years ago, but for also earlier this year suggesting that we contact Jennifer Haigh to speak here. And I remember thinking, what a great idea. But I also remember thinking, that might be a tough one. After all, this is an author in very high demand. Jennifer Haigh is the author of the New York Times bestsellers The Condition, Baker's Towers, which was also the winner of the 2006 Penn LL Winship Award, which is a huge big deal for an outstanding book by a New England author. She also wrote Mrs. Kimball, which I remember selling stacks of back at Edwards Books, where I met many of you when I worked there. And the very gripping and hugely successful Faith, just out in paperback this year. Her short stories have appeared in Atlantic, Granta, the Saturday Evening Post, and many other publications. But all you can do is try, I figured, and when I did invite Jennifer to Bookies via Jennifer's publicist, the positive reply came swiftly, and I was overjoyed, for several reasons. The crisis that is the spark for the novel Faith was one with which we Western Massachusetts residents are very familiar. So I knew the storyline of Jennifer's novel would resonate with so many in the area. And Jennifer's personal story is inspiring and interesting to both the readers and writers among us. Faith is amongst the latest great accomplishments for a writer who grew up in what she calls a reading family in Barnesboro, a coal mining community in western Pennsylvania. And that town resembles Barkton, home of her novel, Baker Towers' fictional Novak family. Growing up, she told the Boston Globe several years ago, I didn't know anybody who didn't have a minor in the family. And I think many of us in this area can think I didn't know anyone who didn't have a factory worker, or in my little town, someone who didn't work at Uniroyal, that sort of thing. So I loved that quote. She continued on to say, it was typical to go to someone's house to play and have to be quiet because someone's father was sleeping off a night shift. And that's very familiar to me. Her father taught junior high school English, and her mother was a high school librarian, so many stories and words in that family. Jennifer began to write fiction while attending Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, graduating in 1990 with a degree in French. Fittingly, she studied France, and we have at least 2 people here just back from France, as an undergrad, and after graduating, returned there on a Fulbright scholarship and taught English to inner city kids for a year. Jennifer came back to the States, got into publishing. She worked at Rodale Press, which some of you might know, became an editor at Men's Health, then at senior editor at Self magazine, which I still get. Upon turning 30 in 1998, she said, I came to the realization that this wasn't what I wanted to do with my life. I wasn't the person I wanted to be. So I quit my job, broke my lease, moved to Baltimore, and started writing again. I could afford to live there. So that's what she did. And she began publishing short stories, started writing Mrs. Kimball, a novel about a mystery man who marries 3 women in succession. And she got into the prestigious Iowa Writers' Workshop, finishing the novel there, but more importantly, in a way, finding the workshop processing open and opened her eyes, and was very valuable. And I was telling my workshoppers this past week that it is, you think you're going to go in and work on your own work, and certainly when you look at others, you learn a whole lot. So that's what happened with Jennifer. The book got done. An agent found her rather than the more traditional way around. Mrs. Kimball was sold to a publisher within a couple of months and proved to be such a hit with booksellers, including Edwards Books, who began pressing it onto their book clubs. Spread the word of mouth. It sold 50,000 in hardcover and 60,000 more in paperback. And this is in a story that was probably, the story I'm quoting is about 5 years old, so maybe she can tell you more. But those are fantastic sales for a literary first novel. So that's big for the start of a career that continues to roll wonderfully. If one book does well, it dominoes in a way. It knocks into the second book that you might have an idea for, that you might write, and then another, and then another. And that's pretty much what's happened for Jennifer Haigh, who back on that 30th birthday was wise enough to realize what she wanted to do with her life, and she has done it so very well. So honored to have her here, to drive all the way out from the North Shore today to be our keynote speaker, despite that busy schedule, to have said that swift and thrilling yes to our invitation. So here is Jennifer Haigh.
Wow, thank you, Suzanne. That was really, I have a little lump in my throat. That was a lovely introduction. I'm so happy to be here today at Bay Path College to celebrate the role of book clubs in literary life. Like every writer working today, I owe a great deal to book clubs. They've done so much to keep literature alive and vibrant and relevant to all of us at a time when so many people spend half their lives glued to a screen. So I'm here really out of gratitude to a lot of the book clubs who've welcomed my work. I want to talk a little bit about my novels, particularly my most recent novel, Faith, which Suzanne talked to you a bit about. You know, when my first novel, Mrs. Kimball, was published, it's 9 years ago now, I spent a lot of time traveling around talking to book clubs across the country. I've done them in person, I've done them by telephone, I've done video chats on Skype, I've done live chats with groups that meet only online. And I have to say that in almost every case, I've been struck by how passionately and thoughtfully and completely these readers engage my work. Writing is a very solitary business. In a lot of ways, a writer's life is like that 1981 movie Groundhog Day with Bill Murray. Remember that one? Where Bill Murray's character is forced to live the same day of his life over and over and over again. I write full-time. That's the only thing I do. And so, like most writers I know, I spend a lot of time sitting alone in a room. Every morning I wake up at the same time, I sit in the same chair, I brew the same pot of tea, I look at the same white legal pad, never the yellow, always the white. You know, I really essentially relive exactly what I did the day before. I have an older brother who's an accountant for the federal government, thank God, because he was the kid my parents didn't worry about. And he says that when he thinks about what I do for a living, it's like I play with my imaginary friends all day. And actually, I think that's a pretty good description from an accountant. That's pretty astute. That's what my Groundhog Day looks like. So it's hard to articulate how shocking it is 2 or 3 years later, when a book comes out, it actually appears in bookstores on shelves, and I start having conversations with real living people who have their own relationships with my imaginary friends. Think about that. It's shocking. It's like somebody's eavesdropped on your dreams. I'll never forget the first time I met a total stranger who'd read my first book, Mrs. Kimball. Not somebody, my mother told to buy it, but a complete stranger who just independently discovered this book. We had a conversation about it on an airplane. And when she talked about the characters, Birdie and Charlie, the mother and son in the book, I had such a disoriented feeling. Like, she knows them? How does she know them? It was really quite stunning because up until that point, I'd really believed this was a thing that was mine alone. Something you learn when you start publishing books is that they no longer belong to you, the writer. They belong to the people who read them. And I know I feel that way about the books I love, some of the ones that appear on my top 10 list. You know, I have a copy of Lie Down in Darkness that I don't lend to anybody because what if I need it? And that's how I feel about the books I love. What if I need them? I keep them in the house the way you keep a fire extinguisher, you know, in case of emergency. That's how I feel about those books. They're my books. I know that somebody else wrote them, but I feel that they truly belong to me. They're such a part of my imaginative life. For those who don't know it, my first book, Mrs. Kimball, which Suzanne mentioned, is essentially a story about marriage. It's a story told in 3 parts. It's from the point of view of the first wife, and then the second wife, and then the third wife of the same man. This man is a sort of a con artist named Ken Kimball, and because you see him only through the eyes of these women he marries, you get this kind of shadow portrait of this man who's able to reinvent himself and really be all things to all women. The first time I talked to a book club about Mrs. Kimball, I had a woman come up and talk to me afterward and say, "I've been Kimballed." And what she meant was that she was somebody's third wife. But I loved that idea that suddenly Kimball had become a verb. She'd been Kimballed. It was something that had never occurred to me. It was something I needed to hear from a reader. And book clubs are full of experiences like that, where you hear people's very personal reactions to the stories you invent. Mrs. Kimball turned out to be a huge hit with book clubs, interestingly, something I never imagined when I was writing the book. Those early experiences with book clubs taught me that these groups are full of passionate, very opinionated readers. Honestly, I was floored by their very strong reactions to some of my characters. It was amazing to me how readers really, really hated the husband, Ken Kimball. I was floored by the animosity that they felt for this guy. The 3 wives in the book also sparked some strong reactions. Some of the readers felt sorry for Bertie, the first wife in the book, who's sort of a train wreck. But mostly, they were horrified by her negligent parenting. They were worried what was going to happen to her kids. A lot of the readers admired the second wife, Joan, but some of them were very angry with her. How could such a bright, accomplished woman be taken in by a con artist like Ken Kimball? The truth is, when I'm writing a novel, those characters are absolutely real to me. They're as real as my friends or my family or anybody in my actual life. And I can't tell you how delightful it was to meet readers who take my characters as seriously as I do. It really was a revelation. When my second book, Baker Towers, was published, my publisher once again sent me out to talk to book clubs. And I was prepared for that one to sink like a rock. Seriously, I thought I was going to get deafening silence back from book clubs. Based on my experience with Mrs. Kimball, I thought there's no way this book is going to affect readers in that way because it's so very different. It's set in a different time. The whole tone of the book is different. And I was surprised to discover I was absolutely wrong about that. That, in fact, book clubs responded to that very different book as well. It taught me an important lesson about how versatile readers are and how willing they are to go on all sorts of different journeys with a writer. Baker Towers is set in a little coal mining town, very much like the town where I grew up in Pennsylvania. I wrote that book in about 3 years, but I'd been thinking about it literally for my whole life. I believe that for writers, there are 2 kinds of stories. There are the ones we go chasing after, and the ones life hands to us. If you're lucky, you get one story like that your life hands to you. And for me, that book was Baker Towers. I really felt that was the book I was born to write. The novel takes place mostly in the 1940s and 50s, and it focuses on one family, the Novaks, who live in this little Pennsylvania town at that time. The oldest son in the family serves in the South Pacific in the Navy during World War II. The older daughter works in Washington, D.C. in the Department of the Treasury, and the younger daughter serves in the Women's Air Corps. Really, it's a book about small-town America at that time and how those war years changed everything and everybody, especially the young people who came of age, what Tom Brokaw calls the greatest generation, that cohort of people who became adults in those war years. When I talked with book clubs about Baker Towers, I noticed something very interesting. That this was a book that opened up conversations between generations. I can't tell you how many times a reader has told me, "Oh, I bought your book for my mom," and then she told me I had to read it. And this really pleased me. It was so great to hear from readers in their 70s, "Oh yes, I remember that. Yes, that's exactly how it was." It was very gratifying for me to know that these readers use the book as a way to open up a dialogue with their kids and their grandkids to communicate something about their own past. So that was one lovely discovery with Baker Towers. The other surprise was that that book resonated very strongly with very young readers. I remember talking to a high school book club in Connecticut. And, these are kids who are plugged into cell phones and iPods and, live these very technologically sophisticated lives. And here they were, quite taken with this story that was set in their grandparents' day. Honestly, I would never have predicted that. And, this taught me that I really have no idea who my audience is. None whatsoever. And when I think I know, I'm always wrong. Maybe there are writers who do work with a certain audience in mind, who write for a particular friend or an editor or a book reviewer at the New York Times, but I don't do that. In fact, I put a lot of energy into not thinking about who's going to read my book. I mean, honestly, if I let myself think this, someday my mother is going to read this. Forget it, I'd be paralyzed. I would never write another word in my life. So if I write for anybody at all, I'd have to say I write for myself. I just write about what fascinates me. After all, I'm just a reader. I was a reader long before I was a writer. And I don't think there's anything particularly exotic about my taste. So if something is interesting to me, I just take it on faith that somebody else is going to be interested in that story too. Over the years, I've become very intrigued by the way book clubs read. They don't read the way editors do, or the way literature professors do, or the way book critics do. When book clubs talk about my characters, they think about them the way I think about them, as real people, stumbling through life, making choices that are sometimes admirable and sometimes ridiculous and surprising and frustrating, and sometimes so clearly wrong-headed that you want to take these people by the throat and shake them. That's how I often feel about my own characters, and I see book clubs respond to them in exactly the same way. My third book, The Condition, was particularly popular with readers who happen to be parents or grandparents. It's a contemporary story, and like all my books, it is basically a family story. It focuses on a Boston family who's got a daughter with a very unusual medical condition. The family is turned out inside out when they discover this about their 12-year-old daughter, Gwen. They're taking a family vacation on Cape Cod when her father notices that Gwen is much smaller than other children her age, that she's not even begun to go through puberty at an age when other girls have. It turns out that Gwen's condition is called Turner's syndrome. It's a genetic abnormality. It's something that happens only to girls. And essentially it means that a girl will never mature physically. So when we meet the Gwen character again, 20 years later, looks very much the way she did at age 12. She's this very bright, accomplished woman. She's a PhD in anthropology, and yet her physical appearance is very unusual and very confusing to people. She's, 4 feet 7 inches tall. Her body looks very childlike, and strangers honestly cannot tell whether she is a grown woman or a child. Of course, this colors the way Gwen sees herself, and it affects her whole family. It affects her career choices. Certainly, it affects her dating history. In her mid-30s, she's never been married. She's never had a relationship with a man. She's never even been on a date. It's not an exaggeration to say that having an unusual physical appearance has changed the course of her entire life. Now, this is a story that I felt very deeply when I wrote it, because, it's something I've been aware of my whole life. We live in a world that attaches tremendous importance to the way we look, particularly for women. Our physical appearance affects our careers, how much money we make, whether we're respected or admired, whether we're lonely or loved. Women, especially, benefit tremendously from being beautiful and suffer tremendously if they happen not to fit that narrow definition of what is beautiful. And yet, it's totally unfair. Nobody deserves to be beautiful, and nobody deserves to be homely. It's a genetic lottery, and we sort of get what we get, and it does affect the course of everything that ever happens to us. So it's my preoccupation with this idea that led me to write this book. It's kind of a meditation on what it means to be a woman, on how much freedom and happiness and power we give away while we're obsessing about what our hair looks like. So that's my third book, The Condition. This brings me right up to the present, to last year when HarperCollins published my fourth novel, Faith. Probably the most controversial of my books, and certainly the one that has generated the liveliest debates within book clubs. I've been writing short stories and novels my whole adult life, and I never actually write about myself in any conscious way. I don't write about my parents or my friends or my family, but somehow I do find that my personal experiences kind of worm their way into everything I write. And Faith is a great example of that. This is a book I never would have written if I hadn't, by happenstance, moved to Boston after finishing grad school in 2002. I just finished my MFA in creative writing at the Iowa Writers Workshop and just found a publisher for Mrs. Kimball. So really, it didn't matter where I moved to. I didn't need to have a job. I was just going to be writing full-time. I could have lived anywhere. I chose Boston just because I like that city. It was a fortunate choice for all sorts of reasons. First, because Boston has a very vibrant and welcoming literary culture. But secondly, because that year, 2002, in Boston was a remarkable time. Some of you undoubtedly remember that that was the year when the first reports of the clergy sex abuse scandal were hitting the newspapers, and Boston was ground zero for this story. The Boston Globe spent years investigating these accusations against Catholic priests, and they really did an incredible job. They won the Pulitzer Prize that year for investigative reporting, and in the course of their investigation, they found that the Boston Archdiocese, over about a 50-year period, had literally hundreds of children sexually abused by priests. And not only that, the Boston Archdiocese was aware that this was happening. The Boston Globe uncovered a paper trail leading all the way back to the 1970s, which showed that these accusations had been reported to the Archdiocese. Beginning in the early 80s, Cardinal Law knew that these things were happening, and in several cases, he knowingly reassigned these pedophile priests to other unsuspecting parishes where, hey, guess what? They turned around and did exactly the same thing. That was the story that was all over the newspapers the summer I moved to Boston. Boston is arguably the most Catholic city in America, and it's hard to convey the kind of seismic impact this story had. It really hit people. It really hit me. I was raised in a very devout Catholic family. I went to 12 years of parochial school. In my household, it was not unusual to have a priest at Sunday dinner. And I can honestly say that, for me, nuns and priests were kind of the heroes of my childhood. They truly were some of the most generous and inspiring and loving people I've ever met. And so it was very hard for me to square my own childhood memories of Catholic priests with the horrifying things I was reading in the newspaper. I knew that these things had happened. I didn't question the veracity of these accounts, but it was impossible to make sense of it emotionally. How could priests be like this and also be like that? Like a lot of writers, I turn to writing when I'm trying to make sense of the world, when I'm trying to explain something I find absolutely inexplicable. And that was the impulse that led me to write Faith. So, Faith is set in Boston in 2002, just as the scandal was breaking. The narrator is a lapsed Catholic, a woman by the name of Sheila McGann, whose older brother, Arthur, happens to be a Catholic priest. Actually, Father Art is a really good priest. He's a very dynamic, popular, lovable guy who, out of nowhere, is accused of molesting an 8-year-old boy in his parish. The novel sort of looks at this traumatic situation from all angles. You do see how it tears apart not just the family of the child, who the priest is accused of abusing, but also of the priest's family too. The priest's mother finds it completely unbelievable that her son has done this horrifying thing. The priest's younger brother, who is a father with boys of his own, has a very protective reaction toward the child and jumps to the conclusion that his brother is guilty. And you have here Sheila, the sister, kind of in the middle, unsure what to believe. So that's where the story opens. The accusation has been made. Sheila, the sister, comes back to Boston from Philadelphia, where she's living, and tries to make sense of this. It was an interesting challenge for me as a writer, because it's the first time I've ever tried to write a book in the first person. In fact, in the past, when I've taught graduate students in creative writing, I've always told them, never, ever do this. And here I was in the situation of writing a book in the first person. Sheila is the teller. So the story is really kind of a mystery, in a way. It's Sheila trying to get to the bottom of this question, to uncover the truth about what her brother did and did not do. So that's essentially the scenario. I've talked about Faith with book clubs all over the country. I've met readers who've been touched by the clergy sex abuse scandal personally. Some of them are priests or ex-priests or people who have family members who were abused by priests. I've talked to book clubs that are made up of all Catholics or all Jews or a mix of different cultures and religious backgrounds. And as you kind of imagine, these groups have had very different reactions to the book. For me as the writer, it's been particularly rewarding to see that this is a story that cuts across religious lines, cultural lines, generational lines. It's a story that has meaning for readers, whether or not they're familiar with the world of Irish Catholic Boston, where the story takes place. So I'll be joining in the Q&A a few minutes later with our other three writers. So I'm going to hand over the mic shortly, but I wanted to let you know I will be happy to answer any questions at all about Faith, about my earlier 3 novels, or about the writing process in general. So first, before I go, I want to thank Bay Path College for having me, and especially all of you who are in book clubs or are thinking about starting book clubs or managed to keep them going over many years. It really is a great privilege for a writer to be read and considered so thoughtfully and with such deep attention from people who truly love books. It's a reminder that the work we do really does have value, and that our imaginary friends can go out into the world and meet other people who will love them as much as we do. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I love that idea of sending your imaginary friends out, because it is. You're in your little cave and you don't know what's going to happen, and you hope they do well, but it's because of people like this that they do. So it's wonderful to hear your side of it. Thank you so much. And our next speaker is Durham Caldwell. And if you're like me, you feel like you've known Durham all your life, or that he's been a voice or a presence on your television for most of your life, because perhaps he has if you're from around here. Durham Caldwell grew up in Falmouth on Cape Cod, served in the U.S. Army in the closing months of World War II, graduated from Columbia University, worked 14 years for Massachusetts radio stations before becoming news director at Channel 40 TV in Springfield. He held that job for 24 years, supplementing his managerial duties with such chores as field reporting, anchoring newscasts, interviewing, writing editorials, writing and producing documentaries, and anchoring election night broadcasts. His documentaries have included Springfield Armory, Fight for Survival, Bishop Weldon, A Look Back, and The 60s. After leaving television, he worked 21 years for the Ludlow Register, and his weekly Page 9 interviews included interviews with World War II veterans, which became the backbone of his book, Remembering World War II, published by the Ludlow Historical Commission, which is another book I remember selling at Edwards. His novel, Tumultuous Affairs, deals with politics, civil rights, and journalism in a fictional town much like Springfield, with a healthy and sometimes humorous dose of romance thrown in. Durham and his lovely wife, Jean, a longtime Boston Globe correspondent, celebrate their 65th wedding anniversary, June 14th. So congratulations on that. It's a book in itself, how to do that. That's wonderful. And fans can applaud that and the fact that a new book is up next from Durham. His second novel on the way, I had the first title, an earlier title, but Durham told me it's been replaced. The title that I originally had written down was Betty Sue, A Rocky Path to Respectability, which I thought was very cool. But it's now called A Picture on the Mantle, and the Betty Sue part might be a subtitle, so we can ask him about that. But either way, here is our wonderful Durham Caldwell.
Sounded like a lot of malarkey, didn't it? Good afternoon. Nice to see so many book club people here. And yes, my years at Channel 40 did give me some of the background to write Tumultuous Affairs. And yes, that title does have a double meaning. The action takes place in the 60s and 70s. The central character is a television newsman named Buzz Buckley, whose wife has recently died. As the book opens, he's on a plane bound for San Francisco and the Republican National Convention. You'll remember that convention as the one which nominated Barry Goldwater for president. As he walks down the aisle of the plane, he feels a tug on his sleeve, and he looks down into the face of a woman he used to date in high school, long time before. Now, the astute reader will probably anticipate a romance developing. Well, I can reveal that the astute reader would be right. And it develops with a certain amount of humor, like the time his beloved's husband comes home unexpectedly, Let me read a portion of that. My God, Leo's home, in the closet, quick. She pushed him toward her bedroom closet, scooped up his clothes and dumped them into the closet on top of him, grabbed a robe from the hook on the closet door, silently closed the door, kicked his shoes under the bed, and struggled into the robe all in one fluid, continuous motion as her husband's footsteps came down the hall. You're home early. Lost power in the office. Cramped into Marcia's closet, Buzz could hear everything, including the pounding of his heart. He was forced to crouch there in silence, his own shirt, underwear hanging over his left ear. Marcia's dresses and skirts enveloping his head and shoulders, the aches in his knees and calves becoming progressively more painful as he dared not change his position. And there was dust in the closet. Buzz felt a tiny tickle in his nose, which grew progressively more insistent. Now, you'll have to read the book to discover how that particular sequence comes out. I don't want to spoil it for you. Along with the romance, there's plenty of history. If you're old enough, you'll remember the Goldwater people firmly in control of that 1964 convention and not bashful about showing their muscle. Let me read you another short excerpt. Buzz saw a sergeant-at-arms order NBC's John Chancellor to clear the aisle. When Chancellor, in the middle of a live interview with a former governor of Alaska, didn't move fast enough, the sergeant-at-arms called for reinforcement. Buzz saw Chancellor hustled off the floor by two burly security men disappearing from camera view with the words, John Chancellor reporting from somewhere in custody. The bulk of the action in the book takes place in a fictional city that is very much like Springfield. Issues very much the same: urban renewal, civil rights, the divisiveness of the Vietnam War, the effort to end racial imbalance in the schools. This is the time of Watergate, whose victim, of course, was Larry O'Brien, a Springfield native. Time of landing of the first men on the moon. And gasoline, you'll remember, reached the unheard of price of 43.9 cents a gallon. And of course, there were some rip-snorting local elections, which Buzz gets involved in covering, and in one case helping to manage. I mentioned the Vietnam War. You remember the tussle in the streets of Northampton between two groups of college students on opposite sides of the war issue? And what resembled a football rally as the first Westover Airmen left for Southeast Asia? The sit-down blocking entry to Westover, led by the president of Amherst College. They're all in the book. So are the problems of a low-income housing project, very much like Springfield's Riverview Apartments. And the sit-in the superintendent's office and the vigil on the city hall steps as militants attack de facto segregation and other minority issues. The mass arrests for trespassing on the steps of a public building, and articulate women on both sides of the issues. I've invented the cast of characters. Mayor Big Jim McCann is nothing like Charlie Ryan, but there are real-life people like Richard Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, Sylvia O'Conti, Mossy Donahue, Governor Sargent, Leverett Saltonstall, Ted and Joan Kennedy, making historically accurate cameo appearances. Readers also get an inside look at the operation of a local television station during the period. Our hero, Buzz Buckley, is called on the carpet by management, for example, for running too much news on the civil rights movement. A sales manager quotes a client as saying when he wants news for white people, he goes to the other station. Although the characters in the book are fictional, I can assure you that such things actually happened. One of the book's other colorful sequences describes two of the biggest, bulkiest city councilors going after each other with their fists outside City Hall. Fictional characters, fictional situation, but again lifted right out of local history. Your reading group will find plenty of things to talk about in tumultuous affairs. If you sometimes like to have the author in on the discussions, pepper the author with questions. Tell him what you liked and what you didn't like, what you wondered about. No, I'm available. I live in Springfield. And if we don't tie something down here today, I'm in the phone book. Thank you very much.
That buzz in the closet scene totally wipes from my mind the grim-faced Durham delivering the news, all those years. Just thank you so much. That was great. I love that. So next up is Jeff Foltz. A mother's compulsion to protect her children is timeless and primal. War is insidious and ageless. Birkebeiner is a story of wolf. He's got the wonderful poster over there, too. 2 years after her son Hakon's birth, Inga is with her husband, King Hakon, in the besieged fortress of Lillehammer. The enemy, the Crozier army, is certain to overrun the stronghold. Once the Croziers breach the walls, they will kill Inga's child, heir to the Norwegian throne and the prince who may unite the country. To save little Hakon, King Hakon asks his two best warriors to flee with her son for the safety of what is present-day Trondheim. It's a long and dangerous journey on skis through two treacherous winter valleys and over a 7,000-foot snow-blown mountain. Willing to risk everything for her son, Inga insists on going with them. For 8 harrowing, exhausting days, they're pursued by a cadre of enemy soldiers bent on killing her child. Magnus, the Crozier's military leader, whom the church and the bishop call king, and who has lost his own wife and 2-year-old son, must lead the chase. So that's a little bit to interest you in Birkebeiner. It was written by a guy who 5 times has completed the 52-kilometer, that's 31-mile race, called the American Birkebeiner. It has 9,500 participants and is the largest Nordic ski marathon in North America. So that's something in itself. It was there that Jeff Foltz first saw a portrait of 2 medieval soldiers, heavily armed, on skis, and carrying a curly-haired infant. He made the reasonable assumption that the men were not babysitters, but what were they? The story behind that portrait by Knud Larsen Bergslin drew him to Norway, where he researched the history of 2 Birkebeiner soldiers and the baby. During his studies, he discovered Inga, the baby's mother, how much Norwegian history and the people of Norway revere her. She had to be the main character. Jeff Foltz made his visit in the winter and skied terrain similar to that which his characters traversed over 800 years ago, and the result is his novel, Birkebeiner, a story of motherhood and war. And last week I was Facebooking with a friend about Jeff being here today, and my friend Jay wrote back that he loved reading Birkebeiner, and I responded, "Can you imagine what they went through?" And Jay responded, "I could after reading Birkebeiner." There's a great comeback, and it's the truth. In this book, you are there 800 years ago on those skis on that journey. Written by a man who received a BA in history from Marietta College and an MFA in creative writing from the University of Southern Maine. He's the father of 3 grown children. He has 7 grandkids and lives with his wife, Sue, in Camden, Maine. And we're glad today's weather did not require him to use skis for the 4.5-hour car journey. So thank you so much for being here, Jeff Foltz.
Thanks so much for having me, Suzanne. I've really been looking forward to being here. I want to start with a quick question. How many of you who are mothers have ever asked yourself, what would I do to protect my child? All of you, sure. Well, that's the question that Inga has to live. And I'm going to read just a short excerpt from the book because I think that there's tension throughout the book. And this is one scene that represents some of that tension that Inga has to experience. It's not the beginning of the book, so I'll tell you what you need to know at this point. Ul and Skade are the god and goddess of winter. Nidaros was the name for Trondheim back in the 13th century Norway. They are in the 6th or 7th day of a 8 or 9 day pursuit. They have the two soldiers, the baby and Inga, have an unknown number of soldiers pursuing them on skis, and they are determined to kill young Håkon. They've crested a 7,000-foot mountain and have covered a lot of ground in a huge, vast snowfield. I can't begin to tell you how huge it was. I skied it, and it was just, all you could see was white as far as you could see, except at night when you couldn't see anything. So that's where we are, and I'll start there with a short reading. Moon rises early tonight, says Chervil. Shall we stop after sunset and cook a meal? Probably all we have time for, Torsen says. Inga? I could eat again, and it'll give me a chance to really fill Håkon. We can start a fire in the dark, Chervil says. Let's use all the light we can. Almost as he says it, the sun drops below the horizon. Shadowy gray transforms to black, freckled with stars. Torsen takes Inga's bundle of wood and lights a fire as Ul and Skade throw one of their stars across the sky. Inga watches its orange tail break the blackness around it and disappear. Håkon begins to whimper, and she nurses him while the men roast the last piece of reindeer meat. All of them drink as much water as they can melt and don't leave a morsel of the meat. Inga boils some of the lentils and shreds some of her reindeer into it to give to Håkon. He eats it all. How he can be so good when he's so hungry is a blessing. She kisses his forehead and strokes his face as the moon rises. Moo, Mama, he says, pointing skyward. Yes, sweetie, the moon. It's pretty, isn't it? Ertie, Håkon says, as she rocks him in her lap. He's so beautiful, and he reminds Inga of his father. She watches his face until his eyes droop. Torsen takes him again, and they're ready to go. Silver fingers of moonlight spread themselves over the crests and cornices of snowdrifts, but are unable to wrap their light around and leave stark contrasts. Black against white, light against dark. Inga wonders if that's what the moon is. She wonders if their winter world is nothing but another moon, if life would be better there, fairer, or is it black against white everywhere? With the clear skies comes the bitter, numbing cold again. Even without the wind, the frost bears down and hurts, biting deep into places on Inga's body that never have been cold before. Her knees at the core, not just the skin, her stomach, even shoulders begin to feel the ache. While dinner still sits in her stomach, this iciness probes beneath the skin. This chill moves within, deep and abiding. Flesh and sinew feel it, but it is also capable of freezing the mind with fear. All of them hate to waste the light, but they stop before moonset and dig into a snowdrift for insulation. They have no choice. Torsen, can we light a fire? Inga asks. She struggles to keep her teeth from chattering. Better not. They see it might spur them to keep moving, and I need the darkness to see if they start one. Moon's about to set. I don't see anything. You? She says. No. Is that good? I don't think they'll move in the dark, Torsen says. Too easy to lose direction with no trail or trees. Inga looks up at the silver troll's face, staring down at her from the darkness balancing on the horizon, mocking her black and white world with his. If we build a fire, they can use it as a beacon. Thorson pauses. Inga's close enough to see him squinting, as if straining to see something tiny. Wait, there. Can you see that pinpoint of light? Where? Cherval asks. Thorson raises his arm and aims it. Cherval and Inga both lean in to direct their line of sight. Yes, yes, both in unison. They're that close, Inga whispers. Probably just cresting the edge of the snowfields, still a quarter day behind us. Does that mean they've stopped? She asks. Thorson recognizes the hope in her voice and hears in it an unspoken question. Perhaps, but they may be hoping we will think that, so we'll build a fire that they can move toward. And they may have built a fire and left it for us to see while they march. We just don't dare take the risk, Inga. He puts his arm around her shoulder and throws the side of his furs over her. We'll rest a little and then start out again. The exertion will warm us till the sun rises. Put your hands inside my coat and vest. You can feel Hakan sleeping, warm against my chest. She does, and it helps to know her child is warmer than she is. Cherval presses against her from the other side, and she warms up enough to sleep. When Thorson wakes her, her eyes feel like they never closed. She's stiff, colder than she was when she went to sleep, and not a bit more rested. Now her effort, as Thorson promised, is purging the deep chill, and for a moment she prays again. Thank you for keeping Hakan warm tonight. Help me protect him. Keep the two men leading me strong and resolute. Slow our enemy's pursuit so that we may reach Nidros and the warmth of your church. Inga looks ahead at Thorson and Cherval, the modified contrasts of an inert landscape surround them in dim morning twilight. Their shadows are gray, gray and moving. She looks behind her. Hers is too. A stark truth occurs to her. We are the only difference between this and the moon. Always, maybe not, but tonight we are. She scans the darkness behind her, where she senses the horizon. The speck of light is gone. I'll leave it there, and I'll answer any questions during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
There's an art to know what to read, and leaving them wanting more is always good. So I think both of those sections of readings we've heard will propel us toward the books. And our last author is Jennifer Allis Provost, who I saw in the hall earlier, and she did look like a student to me. And 2 years ago, she's a graduate of the 2010 class here at Bay Path College, and she said she's having some flashbacks as she's here, wondering about her papers being late and such. So, if she's, but she looks like she's in good shape now. She's a native New Englander who lives in a sprawling colonial, along with her beautiful and precocious twins, a dog, a parrot, maroon-bellied conure to be exact, 2 cats, and a wonderful husband who never forgets to buy ice cream, which is something we should all have. Jennifer is also a graduate of this very college, as I said, and we're very proud to have her here today to check in with family, if you will, and to show us what she's been up to. As a child, Jennifer read anything and everything she could get her hands on, including a set of encyclopedias, and I love that image. But fantasy was always her favorite. She's the author of books including Heir to the Sun, Rise of the Diva She, and Hunter's Lake, and when not writing her next titles, she spends her days drinking vast amounts of coffee, arguing with a computer, and avoiding any and all domestic behavior. So we're lucky to have her here today to include us in her to-do list for today. So thank you very much, Jennifer.
The encyclopedias were Funk and Wagnall's 1952 edition. As Suzanne said, thank you for introducing me. I'm a 2010 graduate of Bay Path. Thank you so much, Brianna. It's an interesting road that I've had because I graduated with a bachelor's degree in business administration. I had a 12-year long and storied career in the insurance industry. Thought, wow, I really don't want to have 12 more years in the insurance industry. And I started writing fantasy novels. We've got 2 full-length novels published. They're the first 2 in my series, The Chronicles of Partholon. I've also just sold another 4-book series called The Copper Legacy, which will be debuting June of 2013. And I'm not going to read from any of those. I'm going to read from a short story anthology that I'm published in. The anthology is called Unconventional. It talks about paranormal gatherings using the guise of conventions. And as I said, I had a 12-year career in the insurance industry, and you'll see some allusions to that in this. The whoosh of the air conditioners intensified the cavernous underground effect of the auditorium. But instead of stone, we are surrounded by gray, fabric-esque walls and nondescript patterned carpeting, all the better to hide the inevitable spills. A long stage, reminiscent of school plays, occupied one end, while the other held tables of finger sandwiches and other assorted appetizers. A vast sea of folding chairs stretched betwixt the two. It was the same, nearly identical even, as all the conferences Amy and I had attended before, and would probably be a dead ringer for many as yet unscheduled events. I imagine that hell was an auditorium that held endless conferences, with the denizens doomed to an eternity of egg salad sandwiches and lukewarm beer. I sighed and sipped my Merlot. At least the booze is free. Amy nodded her agreement. These conferences put the bore in boring, and alcohol was our only solace. Actually, what we really needed was to not attend in the first place, but Amy and I had just been promoted to senior underwriters. Our new lofty status, coupled with all the letters that now trailed after our names, made our presence mandatory. Is it wrong to want a demotion? Anyway, Amy and I were both singled out for recognition at this conference because of our recent promotions and our plethora of professional designations. That's a lot of peas. Time to ease up on the wine. Oh, and because we're women, you would think, what with us having the right to vote for the past 100 years or so, that it wouldn't be such a big deal to have successful women in an organization, but no, we're still a rarity. No matter what the propaganda says, the glass ceiling is very much present in corporate America. In fact, our entire company, Living Financial Corporation, was frequently lauded for having so many women in leadership positions. In a perfect world, people like Amy and me would just be good employees, but the fact that we're successful, intelligent females is newsworthy. And our successful corporation with over 50% female managing officers is super newsworthy. Sure, our CEO's a man, but he's surrounded by smart, capable women. The prior CEO once called us his harem. His office was vacant by lunch. Not only did we employ the most women in upper management, we also ensured more women per capita than any other Fortune 100 company. Our marketing campaign was calibrated to capture the hearts of budding young professionals of the female persuasion, many still clutching their newly minted degrees, and encourage them to live life to the fullest, all the while leaving their trusted insurance company to handle the future. Our slogan was, "Life is not a spectator sport. Get in there, all in." That slogan tended to be printed below some stock photography of women skydiving or rock climbing without a care in the world. If they went splat, we'd pay their heirs handsomely. And if they survived their many adventures, which most did, we'd begin payments promptly on their 65th birthday. Want another? Amy had been sucking down gin and tonics like they were water. Before I could fire off a witty comment about the dangers of excessive alcohol consumption, she nodded at my empty glass. Okay, so I sucked down the Merlot like it was water. Like I said, this place was boring. We sidled up to the bar, which, in stark contrast to prior conferences, was staffed by several young men. It seemed that someone had finally gotten the memo that attractive people get better tips. As I clutched my refilled wine glass and ignored Amy's lame attempts at flirting, I surveyed the auditorium. I gnawed my lower lip when it hit me. There were almost no men present. Sure, this conference honored women in the industry, but men still make up the majority of the workforce. Even more strangely, the few men in suits looked like they'd hit the open bar a bit too hard. Check out Bill. I nudged Amy's ribs with my elbow. Bill was our chief underwriter, and you'd never find a more straight-laced, by-the-book man anywhere. He accepted nothing less than excellence, both in his work and in his appearance. Just as his files were never out of compliance, his shoes were always polished and his tie perfectly knotted. But not today. No, the tie was askew, his suit was rumpled, and was that an untucked shirt tail? Scandalous. He's going to get cut off if he keeps it up, Amy said. Maybe open bar wasn't such a good idea. I sipped my wine and silently disagreed. I thought it was a great idea. Time check. Then Bill took off his jacket, which was just about naked for a man of his conservative demeanor. The impromptu striptease made me glance down at my own attire. For the conference, I'd shed my standard uniform of khaki pants and a polo shirt, going for something a little fancier. These conferences may be boring, but my footwear never will be. Amy had also opted for something a bit dressier, a blue dress with impossibly tall black boots. I was about to ask how she could walk on those things when the most annoying employee of Living Financial snuck up behind us. "My double A pupils," chirped a voice that made me cringe, sending icy waves down my spine. I didn't have to turn around to know that Maggie Wilson, our training and development coordinator, had found us. "That's us." I gulped some more Merlot. At this rate, I'd be wasted before the speeches. Awesome. "Now, I trust you girls have made time for our guest of honor." Maggie's voice warbled between a sing-song and a caterwaul. She'd rustled her iron-colored hair into pin curls and wore her standard ensemble of pencil skirt, white blouse, and cardigan. Horn-rimmed glasses perched on the very tip of her nose, held on by one of those beaded lanyards sold at school craft fairs. Her shoes were soft brown loafers. If they got any more sensible, they teach logic and rhetoric. "We'll be here for the speakers," Amy said a little too quickly. We'd only ever left one conference early, the one in Boise for the release of new risk codes. I know, more evidence of my glamorous lifestyle. And as far as I knew, no one had ever caught on. I wanted to keep it that way. "Oh, not the speaker." Maggie leaned a little closer, conspiratorial glint in her eye. "The true guest of honor. The one we're all here for." Our blank stares must have spoken volumes, but the ever-prepared Maggie didn't miss a beat. Heck, with shows like she was like those clodhoppers, she made her own beats. She beckoned us to follow her, her gestures saying we were about to be let in on a great secret. I figured this knowledge was the fancy ladies' room, stocked with everything from hand lotion to extra pantyhose in nude and black. Was I ever wrong? Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's all material. You know, you're 12 years, it's all material.
12 long years.
Yes, that's great. Thank you for sharing that and inspiring us to use our own workplaces. So now we have question and answer time. Does anyone have questions for any of our authors? What's up next? Their writing days, favorite colors? Mary Ellen.
I have a question for Jennifer Haigh. First of all, I really loved the way you talked about your characters as your imaginary friends and how you wanted to share them with us. It's a really interesting perspective. But curiosity about your first novel, which I have not read, but would love to. Each of those characters, do you set that section of the book in during the time that they're married to Mr. Kimball, or just weird question, right?
No, it's a great question. Of the three wives, you see two of the three married to Ken Kimball. The first wife you meet only after Ken Kimball has left her, although you do see a lot of their marriage, kind of in retrospect. But the other two you see when they're actually married to the guy.
Another question? Yes, Jenna.
Oh, sure, yeah. Book groups I've been to, they kind of vary quite a bit in terms of who's in the room. There are more clubs that are full of women than men, but I went to a terrific one. It was a group of retired emeritus faculty at Princeton University, and they were mostly married couples. And so, I think probably the youngest person in the room was mid-60s. it's one of the best clubs I've ever done, actually. The questions were fantastic. I think I was there 2 or 3 hours, and they just did not let up. They were relentless and great. I've never encountered such committed readers. So, definitely it skews toward the female, but I've encountered both.
Yes.
I was wondering how you develop your characters. Are they from real life, or from compositing people you know, or they just come from, thin air? I know they're fictional, but...
They are fictional. I don't really have an autobiographical instinct, so I'm not in any of my books. The people close to me aren't in any of my books. But I certainly do borrow characteristics from people I know. Sometimes I find myself imagining a character's face as resembling a face of somebody I know. The reader will never know this, and the person on whom the character is modeled will never know this. It's just the face I have in my head. I can't seem to invent a face out of thin air. So I'm certainly aware of, drawing bits and pieces of characters from life. Sometimes they are composites. More often than not, though, I start with one detail that is familiar to me and invent the rest of the character around it.
Any other questions? Mariella, you're going to win.
Question for Durham Caldwell.
Hi.
Suzanne had said that the name of your new book is being changed, and I'm just wondering, one, why that's happening. I'm assuming it's the publisher, and two, if you like the new title, I kind of like the original title better.
Well, I'm a little bit up in the air at the moment. I've had 4 or 5 titles, I guess, and right now I'm leaning toward A Picture on the Mantle, because it's the picture on the mantle that sets the stage for the plot of the whole book. However, I gather Suzanne feels that the rocky path to respectability is more something that will drag people in. Now, whether I can make that the subtitle, The Picture on the Mantle, and down at the bottom, Betty Sue's Rocky Path to Respectability, I'm not sure. I'm still working on that. But I'd appreciate any advice.
Yes, Bernadette.
Thank you all for showing up today. I'm curious about your process. Do any of you write outlines? Do you know where you're going? And are you obsessively taking notes all the time? Take files as you're writing along?
This is a great question by someone who was just in the writing workshop here at VPath. So why don't we go down the line, just because I'm curious too about how things come together. If each of you could address, do you use an outline or not, or how do you line things up? Sure, Darren, you want to start?
I probably have the most. This book probably has the most unusual history of any of the writers here, because I had Buzz with a romance with Marcia, and also another romance which I didn't touch on here, and they happened at separate times. And I had a lot of national and local history I wanted to cover. So I wrote this pretty much in 3 parts. I wrote Buzz's adventures with Marcia. I wrote Buzz's other romance. I wrote the historical stuff after quite a bit of research at the public library in Springfield, as well as what I remembered from those days. And then I had, in effect, 3 piles of chapters, taking them out and fitting them together in something that would be a reasonable chronological order. And I don't think you can tell reading the book now which came first or which came second, but the 3 parts did seem to fit together. I didn't write an outline per se, but it was sort of an outline up here, yeah.
Jennifer Haigh, how do you go about it?
I don't ever write outlines. I usually spend about 6 months thinking about the story before I write anything. And typically what I'm doing in those months is just taking long walks and talking to myself. And I sort of put off starting until I can't wait any longer. Then it becomes not a chore that's hanging over my head, but something I'm dying to do. So I wait until I can't wait anymore, and then I start. Typically I know maybe one event in the story. There's one event I'm writing toward. For instance, my third book, The Condition, the story about Gwen who has Turner syndrome. The only thing I knew about that book when I started writing was Gwen has Turner syndrome, and at some point she's going to fall in love with somebody. So that was the one thing I knew was going to happen in the book. I didn't know when or with whom or how it was going to turn out, whether it would be a disaster. I knew none of that. I just knew that she would fall in love with someone. And that was enough to get me started writing. Usually, I know nothing more than that. Sometimes I have an event in mind, I get to it, and then I decide, no, I don't think she would do that. I know her better now, and I don't think she would. So I'm kind of working without a map when I'm writing out a story, and it's in the process of writing the first draft that I figure out what the story is.
Thank you. How about you, Jeff?
I don't use a formal outline. I more like Jennifer, I become so acquainted with my characters. I'm working on another novel now, and I just feel like I've got a character who's not cooperating, and so I keep going back and whacking him around. And I think, first of all, I don't write sequentially either. I always know the beginning and the end, and if I feel like I'm getting stuck, I'll just go to another scene that I want to write, and I'll write it. And then I'll see where it fits. And that may sound a little funny, but it seems to work for me. If I'm not satisfied with a character or a scene, I go back and do what I call layering. And for instance, I'll layer in an emotion that I thought was lacking or that I wasn't showing the reader well enough. Or I'll layer in an event that will create more tension at a particular point in a chapter or in the book itself. And so on the novel I'm working on now, I'm in what I call the layering stage, where I'm going back and saying, no, he would not have done that, or she would not have done that, because I know her better now. And this was really prevalent in Birkebeiner with Inga and Magnus. Now, that's not the way Inga would react. That's not what Magnus, who's the bad guy in Birkebeiner, but he's not really all bad. He's kind of a conflicted dude. And so going back and trying to layer in those nuances, to me, is my kind of outline, and it's the reverse is an outline after the fact, I guess.
Thank you. How about you, Jennifer Allis Provost?
I don't think I do anything writers are supposed to do. At least that's what my editors told me. I tend to start with an overall concept of where I want to go with a book. And I usually end up starting in the middle. Like, okay, we're here, and here's how we're going to end up. And I write the second half, and then I think, well, how did we get to the middle? I mean, lots of events had to occur to get there. My second novel, For Heir to the Sun, it ended up being two stories that I had to weave together in the end. I told the main character story beginning to end, and then I realized that there were a lot of other things going on that we needed to get to in order for this to really be fleshed out, for the world to really make sense. So I went and added in, ironically enough, a love story. It's quite sweet. And I really did drive my editor nuts with that one, because I kept emailing her thinking, well, what if we put this here, and what if we put this here? And I was moving chapters, and I was taking chunks here and putting them here. And in the end, it came together well.
Wow. It all works. Thank you. How about one more question, and then we'll, yes.
Well, this is a fitting one to the last question. When you're finished, this is a general question, when you're finished writing, how do you feel about your characters? Do you want to put them away, or do you miss them?
I write in series, so I love my characters. I want them to hang out with me forever.
Jeff?
You do become acquainted with your characters, I think. The problem I'm having with the question is the definition of finished. I have a feeling I would work on a book forever if it was not in print. So it's finished when it's printed. And then, there are parts of Birkebeiner I wish I had back. But I've talked to a lot of authors who have that same feeling that Dennis Lehane always talks about the book he wish he had back. And so I don't know if that's prevalent with anybody else here, but there's always something that keeps it unfinished in your mind, and I think that's what drives me. I want to finish it, and there's a point at which I say, okay, this character is as good as I can make him, and then we print it, and it's finished then.
Durham?
I would pretty much echo Jeff, I guess. When I finished Tumultuous Affairs, I thought of course I worked on it for 10 years or so, so I figured the characters were about as far along as they were going to get. But I was thumbing through it this morning, and sure, there were some places I could have done some other things, but as far as character development goes, I'm satisfied with the character development.
I hate finishing a book. And in fact, for about 6 months before I finish, I feel a creeping depression because I know very soon I'm not going to have a book anymore. And this has happened to me 5 times now. Every time I finish a book, I feel that every thought I've ever had is in that book. And I got nothing left now. I should just go to beauty school because I'm completely done as a writer. And it takes me a long time to stop feeling that way. I have at least, I don't know, the first year after I finish a book is very bleak to me. And, I start things and I abandon them. And I do feel that the center has dropped out of my life completely, in part because I don't do anything else. I'm not married, I don't have kids, I have no pets, I have no plants, I don't have a job. So what do I have if I don't have a book? I got nothing. So it's a very panicked time for me, and it really doesn't get better until I'm well into another book. So the finishing is the worst part.
Wow, thank you. We have a half a finger for, okay, one more.
When you go out to book clubs, all of you, after having written these books, have spent so much time in a solitary situation, and your readers come back to you. What does that feel like? I mean, I'm sure it's not always positive, but does it give you sort of a sense that you would like to have taken some of their thoughts or theories or suggestions and reworked things? Do they often do they make you critique your work in a way that you wish you might change it? Or do you just feel very justified? And I suppose it's always in that.
I had someone yell at me. And I'm not saying spoke to me and had strong opinions. I had someone absolutely up one side and down the other over a character that I killed. She was really upset, and I was nervous walking to my car. And then she told me it was the worst book she'd ever read, and I was foolish, and blah, blah, blah. And I went like this. And then afterwards, you just sit back and you think, wow, I created a character that someone felt that strongly about, that they felt the need to beat me up at a library? I guess I did something right.
Yeah, you do get some strong opinions. The comments I've gotten have, for the most part, been very nice, very kind. But I've had 2 that stick in my craw a little bit. One was from somebody who obviously fancied himself as a scholar of 13th century Norway. And, I just butchered the history of 13th century Norway. And I tried to explain to him that this is fiction, and that didn't do it. And so I then tried to explain that the people who recorded history in 13th century Norway were the people who were writing the myths, the sagas. They were the novelists of their time, and they were trying to create heroes. They were not looking for accuracy. So that was one. That didn't do it for him either. But he just wanted to tell me what an expert he was in 13th century Norway. And the other one was, I just had this guy come up to me and he said, potatoes are post-Columbian. I said, what? And he said, you had them eating potatoes, and potatoes are post-Columbian. And I said, what do you mean post-Columbian? He said, Columbus went to America in 1492 and he brought the potato back to Europe, and you had him eating potatoes in 1205. I'm sorry. Should have been spaghetti. So those are the only two really, in any way, negative things that comments that I've had.
Durham or Jennifer, any experiences?
Well, I said that Buzz has relationships with two women in the book, and you got a sample of the first one, which was not nearly as unorthodox as the second one. And the criticism that I've had from a few readers at clubs is, why did you have to have that particular relationship in there? Well, I thought it fit the characters very well, and I thought it might make some book club members talk. I didn't know for sure, but that's really about the only thing that I ran into with Tumultuous Affairs.
Jennifer, anything?
Yeah, I mean, by and large, I find it really gratifying to hear readers' responses, no matter what they are. Really, as writers, we just want to be read, and to be read with attention is a great thing. I've never had the feeling of wishing I could have a book back and do something differently, because by the time it's published and somebody reads it, I've been living with those characters for so long that it feels like that's just how it happened. I can't imagine having written this story differently because I remember it as a thing that really happened. I sound a little nuts saying this, I realize that, but it becomes fact to me after living with it for so many years and going through the long editorial process. By the time it lands in a reader's hands, it just is what it is, and I can't conceive of it being any other way.
Thank you so much. I think we will end this portion. We want you to have enough time to look at the books and get books signed and speak with our authors if you like. So my last act up here is to give a lovely parting gift to each of them and throw something on the floor. And to thank them so much for coming today and for letting us enter your world for this afternoon. Thank you so much.